This is part 3 of the Civil War presentation. In this photo here, you can see some of the ruins of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital at the end of the war. I want to focus on two critical battles in the middle of 1863. These really represent the turning point of the Civil War. One was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought over 3 days from July 1st to 3rd, 1863. The other was the Battle and Siege of Vicksburg, which came to an end on the 4th of July, 1863. And these were both extremely important Northern victories that made an enormous difference in the outcome of the war. Let's begin with Gettysburg. The South had a strategy. They thought that if they could carry the war to the North and threaten the security of Northerners and even a northern city, such as Philadelphia or Washington, then they could maybe force the North to enter into a peace agreement. And remember that if the war is a tie, the South wins. They get what they want. They get to secede. There are a couple of particular parts to this battle that I want to focus on. We'll do that when we're looking at maps, Little Round Top and Pickett's Charge. And then we'll consider what might have happened if the South had won the Battle of Gettysburg, and it could have happened. The map on the left is at the end of the second day. The map on the right is the climactic third and last day of the battle. Now, I just want to point out Little Round Top is right here. And Confederate troops were trying to overrun the Union position here so they could outflank the Union Army and come back around. And had they been able to do that, it would have been very, very difficult for the Union. But a small force of defenders heroically stopped the Confederate advance at Little Round Top. Now, the other key event that I want to focus on of the Battle of Gettysburg is on the last day. A lot of the advisors to Robert E. Lee, including General Longstreet, were asking that he simply withdraw and do a flanking maneuver, travel onward to try to get to more favorable terrain. But what he chose to do was to send a large force uphill over a long open field and to try to overrun the Union lines. The Confederates bombarded the lines with artillery for a long time before this, but mostly the artillery was aimed too high and mostly it missed. And this would prove to be a fatal mistake that they made. In class, we're going to see some video on this, and I think you'll have a better understanding after we do this. But the defeat of Pickett's Charge turned out to be one of the most critical events of the war. Now, what would have happened had the South won this battle? Well, they might have been able to move into Philadelphia and take the city. The Union did not have adequate defenses for that. This was the main Union Army right here at Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. They also might have turned a little bit more south to the national capital, to Washington. And had they taken either city, they might very well have forced the North into some kind of peace agreement. Now, the other battle that I'd like to look at is the Battle of Vicksburg. The Mississippi River was controlled by the Union with the exception of one stretch of the river from Port Hudson in Louisiana to Vicksburg, Mississippi. And the goal of the Vicksburg campaign for the North was to gain complete control of the Mississippi, and that would cut the Confederacy in two. and deal a devastating blow to their mobility. Um, there was a long siege of Vicksburg. By the end of it, people were eating rats. They were simply being starved out, uh, and the Confederate forces at Vicksburg finally had no choice but to surrender, ironically, on the 4th of July of 1863. Now, as a result of this Union victory, as I said, number one, it meant that the South was divided in two. And number two, that army, which was led by Ulysses Grant, was turned over to General William Tecumseh Sherman, and from there he launched his eastward, what he called his march to the sea, and that divided the Confederacy in a different way between North and South after Vicksburg had divided it between East and West. Now, this will give you an idea of the geography of this battle. Port Hudson is down here. The Union controlled the Mississippi up to this point, but then the Confederates were in control. And if you follow the river up here to Vicksburg, it's this section of the river that was being fought for here. And by defeating the Confederate forces at Vicksburg, the Union was able to gain control of the entire length of the Mississippi. And as you can see, that separates the East from the West. And then from there, General Sherman marched eastward. Now, the last 2 years of the war were to a great extent a war of attrition. Grant took command, and his approach was simply to keep on fighting, to send more and more and more troops into battle. If he lost a lot, he lost a lot, but the South didn't have as many troops that they could afford to lose, and sooner or later they would simply run out of resources, and that's basically what happened. At the same time, as I said, Sherman marched eastward to the sea, and he abandoned supply lines. He didn't try to, have a line of railroad connections and other types of transportation to supply his army. He simply lived off the land, and this was devastating to the people in his path. What he needed, he took, and that created enormous destruction along a wide swath of Southern territory. The Southern strategy by this point was to try to hold out and hope that the Democrats could win the presidential and congressional elections of, it says 19 there, obviously 1864. The Democratic candidate that year was George McClellan. That's the same George McClellan who had been a Union general who had been fired by President Lincoln. And he was a war Democrat, not a peace Democrat, but his commitment to following the war through came into some question. And Lincoln and the Republicans thought that it was absolutely necessary to keep the Democrats from controlling the White House and Congress. They were able to do that, but it seemed to be touch and go for a while. Lincoln also had a challenge from within his own party, from John C. Fremont, who had been the Republican candidate in 1856. He was a Mexican War veteran, and he thought that Lincoln was moving too slowly on slavery. He wanted to, be more aggressive in eliminating it. So Lincoln, for a time, looked like he was going to have trouble. So he chose a Democrat from Tennessee as his running mate, a Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson. Now, you might say, wait a minute, Lincoln's a Republican, but he chose a Democrat. And Tennessee had seceded from the Union, but he chose someone from Tennessee. Well, here was his thinking. he wanted to try to appeal to the border states in the lower north. Um, and although Tennessee had seceded as a whole, eastern Tennessee, much like West Virginia, contained a lot of Unionists, people who were fiercely loyal to the Union, and Andrew Johnson was one of them. And that's the group of voters that Lincoln wanted to appeal to. Um, Unfortunately, Johnson was not only uh, a Unionist, he was also a racist. And as we'll see when we discuss Reconstruction, his policies after the end of the Civil War and after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln were absolutely disastrous. Now let's talk a bit about the end of the war. Um, in the climactic final battles, it was a kind of a duel between Grant and Lee in Virginia. The fighting was absolutely brutal. For example, at the Battle of Cold Harbor, the Union suffered 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. Weapons were getting more sophisticated, but generals continued to simply send troops in a frontal assault on the opposing line, even though they were being mowed down at an absolutely frightful rate. But as I said, the North could afford to lose more, so it basically outlasted the South. Grant wasn't fancy as a general, but he was effective. Sherman, after he marched to the sea, turned northward to reinforce Grant and put more pressure on the South. Richmond, the Confederate capital, finally fell on April 2nd of 1865. You have a reading assigned from a book called April 1865. It's posted on Moodle, and you need to read that. It's about the fall of Richmond. It's an amazing story. A week later, on April 9th, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And that was, for the most part, the end of the Civil War. There was another Confederate army in the field that had not yet been defeated, and there were skirmishes that lasted even into June out in the West. But basically, this meant that the war was over. Early in 1865, Lincoln succeeded in getting the House of Representatives to pass the 13th Amendment. Now, this was the official legal end to slavery nationwide. The Emancipation Proclamation, which we've already studied, had a limited effect, but this was the final end to slavery, and they made sure that it would be legal because they amended the Constitution to do it. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the oppression of African Americans stopped. It did not. And there were things that were done long after the 13th Amendment that really look a whole lot like slavery. Those are things that we'll study later on in the course. But at least on paper, this was the end to slavery. It was ratified by the 3/4 of the states in December of 1865. The last topic in this story is one of the great tragedies of American history. On the night of April 14th, it was a Friday, Lincoln took his wife to Ford's Theater for a popular play. But there was a Southern plot. A group of conspirators, including John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor, well-known actor, but also a rabid Southern sympathizer. They developed a plot to kill not only Lincoln, but the Vice President Andrew Johnson and the Secretary of State William Seward. William Seward was stabbed and badly injured, but recovered. The assassin of the Vice President lost his nerve and never did carry through that attack. But the one attack that tragically was successful was the one on President Lincoln. He died, or he was shot at Ford's Theater, which is still standing, and the presidential box where he was sitting is still roped off, and it is part of it is a museum, but it's also functioning as a real theater. You can go and see plays there if you're in Washington. Lincoln was taken across the street to a home and died there early the next morning. And we're not quite sure exactly what was said, but Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, who was there, is said to have announced, "Now he belongs to the ages."